Infinity Train is an anthology miniseries that first aired on Cartoon Network, before moving to the streaming service HBO Max for its third season. The first season followed the adventure of coding whiz Tulip, as she struggled to find logic in an illogical setting. Meeting, befriending, or running away from all manner of strange characters and using her experiences in the train to better understand herself and come to terms with her parents' divorce back home. Though Season 1 is largely self-contained, the premise alone invited potential for more seasons on the train, something Cartoon Network and creator Owen Dennis took full advantage of by making the show an anthology series. Season 2 followed a new set of characters that, while familiar to Season 1, branched in a completely different direction and tackled themes of identity and what it is to be alive and your own person, all while constantly straddling the line on just dark enough that kids could handle it and, "Oh my god, you just killed that man!" While each season follows a new passenger on the train, the general concept remains the same. The train is meant to be used as a tool for those whose lives have been consumed by self-loathing, sorrow, trauma, and a myriad of other issues that probably plain old therapy could solve, but what the hell. Each passenger has a number embedded on their hand that goes up or down depending on their actions in the train. Once it reaches 0, they're allowed to return home and resume their lives, hopefully taking what they've learned with them. Simple, but effective.
Oh, wow! So it's a good thing my number's going down? I'm growing as a person? Thanks, train. So glad an inanimate object likes me!
The thing that separates Infinity Train from other shows or stories that take mundane protagonists to fantasy worlds is that the consequences aren't limited to the train itself. Owen Dennis has clarified that the train doesn't operate on typical fantasy world rules, and that whatever time passengers spend on it is how much time passes in the regular world. The train itself is far from benevolent. There are several cars that pose genuine danger to the passengers, and terrible cockroach-like creatures called gomes that live in the wasteland surrounding the train, just waiting for passengers to let their guard down. Season 3 had its episodes drop throughout August of 2020, and took many of the plot and setting conceptions of the previous seasons and turned them on their head. The story focuses on a cult of teenagers and children that was first introduced in Season 2, the Apex. These children believe that the train is their right, and that the higher their number is, the more powerful they are. Thus they have a complete disregard for the non-human denizens of the train, whom they call nulls.
Null? It means nothing. Not even a 0. I read it in a book.
When the leaders of the Apex, Grace and Simon, are separated from the others, they begin the trek back to their car, but come across a young girl named Hazel and her denizen protector named Tuba. Though they're loath to associate with the denizen, Grace and Simon feel an obligation to induct Hazel into their fold, and guide them both back to the Apex. With Hazel's closeness with Tuba constantly driving a wedge between Grace playing along for her sake, and Simon who wants to be rid of the ape as quick as possible. The mutual animosity between Simon and Tuba comes to a head in episode 5, where they're forced to work together to solve a puzzle and get to the next car. While they seem to start getting along, with Tuba even opening up to him about her children who aren't around anymore, after Tuba becomes separated from the group, Simon's true colors are revealed.
Teamwork begins with two people trusting each other. But you're no person.
You're the jerk of the week. You're a jerk and it's your week.
Hazel, of course, is distraught after Simon callously tells her he killed her.
You never have to worry about that null again.
Is she?
Yeah, I wheeled her.
You really outdid yourself like a crazy super jerk.
Before they leave the next car in episode 6, Hazel wishes to find a proper place to have a funeral for Tuba, which Grace indulges despite her prior indifference to her. However, Hazel's insistence that Grace say a few words
Funerals have people talk at them.
brings out another side of Grace that she probably didn't realize she had.
Tuba was nice to me, too. She was quiet, but not in a bad way. And she helped us, and was pretty brave, and...
It's okay. That was good.
Before, when Grace talked about denizens, she had, at best, an uninterested apathy towards them, and cruel contempt at worst. The entire Apex are introduced in Season 3, raiding a train car whose denizens were just putting on a play for their own amusement. When one of these denizens is brought back to the Apex's car, Grace coldly tells the kid who brought it to wheel it.
Wheel it or whatever.
It's not even that Grace or the other kids in the Apex are terrible killers with no remorse. Well, mostly. It's just that none of them see the train as anything but one big game, and the denizens mere playthings to do with as they please.
See, Lucy? It's nothing. Just something to play with when we're bored. And honestly, you're boring me.
They don't consider the greater finality in their actions, the greater finality of death. This got me thinking, how does media, specifically media that kids are drawn to, handle themes like violence or death and the finality that entails? There's a concern among certain moral figures that the media children consume can have lasting negative impacts on their lives. Be this media exaggerated but easily imitated slapstick violence, bloody and gruesome imagery in video games, or two women affirming their love in a civil ceremony. Certainly some of this concern comes from sincere places, especially in how and when we approach the topic of death to children. The fact that life is finite and incredibly fragile can often be hard for younger children to grasp. Yet that's usually around the time we see them exposed to these themes. It's probably not a stretch to say that a lot of children's earliest exposure to death, if it wasn't a familial example, is from the various Disney movies spanning several decades. Death comes up a lot in these movies, especially when you're a parent.
You'll be fine, Elsa.
Even parents we never see in the movies themselves aren't safe, as in the case of Lilo and Stitch, where Lilo and Nani's parents are said to have died in a rainy car crash before the events of the film, and their death has clear ripples on Lilo's behavior because of it.
Pudge controls the weather.
There have been numerous studies into the way death is depicted in Disney movies alone. One study cited in an article for the National Center for Biotechnology Information says that of 57 Disney and Pixar films analyzed, at least one death occurred in 84.2% of the movies. Of those deaths, 31.6% were portrayed as reversible, either physically or by characters returning as spirits, and that 63.2% of those reactions were portrayed as either positive or lacking in emotion. It's not out of the question to assume that a lot of younger children may not form a concrete view of death from movies made from studios like Disney and their peers, as a number of the more famous or infamous deaths in these films are either reversed by the time of the climax, or the character is shown to return as a spirit or guide at some point. It doesn't take away the emotional power of their deaths, especially in the case of something like The Land Before Time or The Lion King, where we're witness to the actual moment of Mufasa and Littlefoot's mother's deaths, and see the prolonged emotional fallout both children have to face afterward. Still, the overtly spiritual nature of their involvement in the rest of these films can create some confusion as to the finality of death in real life. If you were raised with some religious background, as I was raised with a Christian one, the idea of life continuing after death may have been used to sate your fears about dying, if you had any. This idea of a heaven or some kind of afterlife persists in media, either by having characters directly talking about the idea of a soul.
Mom says it's something inside of all good things, and that it goes on forever and ever.
Or by portraying some form of afterlife, or even pre-life, such as Pixar's most recent film, Soul.
Is this heaven?
No.
Is it H-E double hockey sticks?
Hell, 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 hell.
There's no consensus whether portraying or telling children about an afterlife is overtly harmful, as nobody can really prove what happens after you die. But the portrayal of death in the movies and shows they watch can help better their understanding and acceptance of it. Sesame Street has handled the topic of death several times during its extensive lifespan on air. The most notable instance being the episode Goodbye, Mr. Hooper, which tackled the sudden death of the titular beloved character after the real-life and equally sudden death of his actor, Will Lee. Rather than recast the character or state he had moved away, as is fairly common in TV or film.
Where's Dean Toadblatt?
Where? Ha! Silly child, that's me!
No, you look different, and you sound different too. Oh.
The Children's Television Workshop decided to address the topic straight out, using Big Bird's reaction to mirror many of the questions young children often have when a loved one dies.
Big Bird, when people die, they don't come back.
Ever?
No, never.
Who's going to take care of the store? And who's going to make my birdseed milkshakes and tell me stories?
Before they aired the episode, the CTW conducted extensive research and surveys into how best to portray Big Bird's reaction, and the responses from the adults.
Why does it have to be this way? Give me one good reason.
Big Bird, it has to be this way because.
Just because?
Just because.
The episode proper ended with Big Bird being introduced to a newborn baby, to contrast the harsh and inevitable topic of death with new life. And Big Bird sums up the themes of life and death in the episode, but much more succinctly.
You know what the nice thing is about new babies?
What's
that, Big Bird?
What?
Well, one day they're not here, and the next day, here they are.
That's right. Yeah, you know, that's true.
That's all well and good, but what does that have to do with how the Apex treats denizens of the Infinity Train?
Wheel it or whatever.
As I said before, there's a concern among certain moral figures as to the way violence is portrayed in media that kids are drawn to. While there have been several studies to show that violence in media isn't always a one-for-one cause and effect for the way children or teens view violence in real life, there is still the lingering concern on how flippantly violence and even death is shown in the media they like.
This isn't a movie, it's a cinematic geek show. It seems to be made by and for people with no cheerfulness, no hope, no trust in human nature.
I think that's well said.
The topic of violence in video games in particular is an interesting one. As the medium has grown and gotten more ambitious over the years, there have been plenty of pearl-clutching individuals who object to any video game, no matter what the content or intent, and dub them as Columbine simulators. Still, I don't want to portray everyone who takes umbrage with the way violence or death is portrayed in games as overly reactionary. There have been plenty of people in the industry itself who have tried to address the issue of the way extreme violence is portrayed in games, some more successful than others. Even the creator of Pokemon, Satoshi Tajiri, has stated the reason he made the Pokemon faint rather than die is because he thinks games as a whole have warped the way children view death. I think that young people playing games have an abnormal concept about dying. They start to lose and say, "I'm dying." It's not right to think about a concept of death that way. They need to treat death with more respect. And sure, you can look at that quote and other quotes from like-minded individuals and say that it's just a case of an old man yelling at clouds. But in complete honesty, it's relatively easy to forget about the finality and death when playing a game. Unless the game itself makes permadeath a feature or challenge mode anyway. A lot of my favorite games have scores of nameless enemies just waiting to be mowed down by the everyday hero, who gleefully kills every one of them with nary a second thought.
Someone will be along to take your drink order.
Games like Dark Souls build their entire gameplay system and mythology around death, giving an in-universe reason as to why the player can constantly come back from death, with the only real consequence being you might lose all your experience points. Even games that feature a permanent death of a supporting character, like Final Fantasy VII, can be a little confusing when you really think about them. I mean, why can't you just pop a phoenix down into Aerith's gaping sword hole if that's what you've been doing every other time her HP went to 0, right? Sure, there's various in-universe explanations for why this can't happen, not the least of which being it would ruin the story. But I keep going back to Tajiri's quote in my head and how we view death because of video games, and he's kinda right. I know I made a jab at it before, but The Last of Us Part 2, a game I liked fine by the way, is an interesting example of something that both tries to address the topic of violence in games, and be as satisfyingly violent as possible. And yeah, it's still a game. If the core gameplay wasn't fun, then nobody would play it. But it still felt kind of disingenuous to see director Neil Druckmann talk about his want to shine a light on violence through the excessive and realistic means Ellie extracts revenge on various people in the game, and retweet several videos of players exterminating waves of NPC goons in gory, albeit creative, ways. The phrase ludonarrative dissonance gets tossed around a lot when critiquing games. That is, the idea of a gameplay's narrative clashing with the gameplay, as coined by game designer Clint Hawking. And Naughty Dog has been accused of this more than once. The fourth game in the Uncharted series even has a tongue-in-cheek trophy named after the term, once you kill 1,000 enemies across one or multiple playthroughs. Said Druckmann about this reference, "We were conscious to have fewer fights, but it came more from a desire to have a different kind of pacing than to answer the ludonarrative dissonance argument. Because we don't buy into it. I've been trying to dissect it. Why is it that Uncharted triggers this argument, when Indiana Jones doesn't? Is it the number? It can't just be the number, because Indiana Jones kills more people than a normal person does. A normal person kills 0 people. It's a stylized reality where the conflicts are lighter, where death doesn't have the same weight. We're not trying to make a statement about third-world mercenaries, or the toll of having killed hundreds of people in your life. It's not like Druckmann or anyone else working on these big releases is ignorant to the weight of violence in games, and how overblown controversy can stir because of it. But even in calling it a stylized reality, we kind of draw a line between the seriousness and weight of real death and violence, and the kind of death and violence we see portrayed in media. And this begs the question as to how far someone will go to justify death and violence if the line is drawn even further. The kind of people who will create a separation between the deaths of people caught in the crossfire of an endless war because they heard about it on Twitter or the news. Well, it's fine that those people died. It's just like swatting a mosquito, after all. That's not to say that ignoring the deaths of nameless enemies in games like this Goomba, or this Waddle Dee, or I don't know, this guy, means you're predisposed to ignore the deaths of innocent civilians when a drone strike happens. But if we start to view certain types of violence and death as justified or unimportant, we start to blur the line and become desensitized to death altogether. At least death that doesn't immediately impact us. When Aerith dies in Final Fantasy VII, that's one of the saddest scenes in video game history. But when this nameless soldier goon dies, you level up and go through the rest of the game without a second thought. There's a scene in the extended version of The Two Towers where Faramir ponders on the nature of one of the Haradrim he just killed, and poses much of the same questions I've been asking, but much more succinctly.
You wonder what his name is, where he came from, if he was really evil at heart. War will make corpses of us all.
This finally brings us back to the apex.
Wheel it, or whatever.
In the beginning of Season 3, both Grace and Simon treat the denizens of the train as if they were enemies in a video game. Goombas to stomp on, Waddle Dees to consume, nameless Russian mercenary number 2358 to punch out, devaluing their existence by calling them nulls.
Aw, that's cute. Lucy thinks it's a person.
This is the kind of thinking that leads to Simon's murder of Tuba, and why he doesn't even think twice about how Hazel would react to it. Grace's initial reaction is sympathy for Hazel, but as she reflects on Tuba, a denizen whom she originally said was one of the good ones,
oh well, Tuba is one of the good ones,
she starts to think about Tuba as an actual person. Someone with a past, someone with feelings of her own. The realization that she was wrong shaking Grace to her core. Before the funeral, Hazel asks many of the same questions regarding Tuba's death that were heard when characters like Mr. Hooper died in Sesame Street.
What if I'm really, really good? I promise I won't do anything bad, ever.
And speaking anecdotally, there's a part of me that really wanted to believe that maybe Tuba could come back. We didn't get to know her any longer than the other denizen companions in past seasons. We probably knew her even less. But I still liked her regardless. And it's not like the show didn't have a previous character nearly die but cheat death later. And thank God, cause Atticus is the goodest boy. But it was different this time. Grace explicitly said Tuba died. And while we didn't actually see it happen, there's no way she didn't land directly on the train wheels. Tuba was dead. And there was nothing that Hazel or Grace or I could do about it.
Everybody will die, of course, sooner or later. Circus performers will die, and clarinet experts will die, and you and I will die. Everybody will die, but very few people want to be reminded of that fact.
I've had a complicated relationship with existential dread ever since I was a little kid. I'm not sure when exactly I was told that my life was going to end. But being raised in a Christian household and having a lot of older relatives, it was bound to come up sooner than later. I'd like to say it's a fear I've come to terms with as I've aged, and depending on my mood, I can think about the inevitability of mine and my loved ones' deaths with some solemn but dignified acceptance. And then there are times when I can curl up into a crying fit and tremble at the question of what it's like to die. What happens afterward, if anything at all? I didn't grow up with it, and I'd be stretching a little to call it a movie geared towards kids. But Watership Down is a movie that a lot of kids in my generation grew up watching regardless. And there's a section near the middle of the film where one of the rabbits goes looking for his older brother who is near death. The song that plays, Bright Eyes by Art Garfunkel, has stuck with me ever since I first saw the movie. The lyrics ask the same questions of what death is like and what may lie beyond it that I've asked several times. The same kind of questions Hazel asks Grace when she can't accept that Tuba is gone. How can someone who was just here be gone so quickly? How can I even fathom the idea of me or anyone else I know someday not being alive? How can a light that burns so brightly suddenly burn so pale? There are no easy answers when dealing with death so realistically, and Infinity Train addresses this with all the tact and, dare I say, grace the topic deserves. The realization and acceptance that life is finite, and you should try to live it out while valuing it and the lives of others, is something that made Season 3 such a powerful season in an already great show. To close this video, there's a quote from Mr. Rogers during his indoctrination to the TV Hall of Fame that sums up Grace's realization and the overall theme of Season 3, but much more succinctly.
Last month, a 13-year-old boy abducted an 8-year-old girl. And when people ask him why, he said he learned about it on TV. Something different to try, he said. Life's cheap. What does it matter? Well, life isn't cheap. It's the greatest mystery of any millennium, and television needs to do all it can to broadcast that, to show and tell what the good in life is all about.
Thank you for being with me, Tuba. I'm going to keep loving you like you're still here. Grace?
Yeah?
I have to go